A chilling, sterile white room, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, and Amelia clutching a life she fought to bring into the world alone. Her millionaire husband, Julian, was supposed to be by her side. Instead, he was with her. But when he finally traded his wife for his mistress, the one person he thought would welcome him with open arms slammed the door in his face. What happens when a man who has everything loses it all in a single day? This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of unexpected alliances and a reckoning no one saw coming. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing tune, a stark contrast to the symphony of chaos erupting in Amelia's world. Lying in the scratchy sheets of the maternity ward bed, she stared at the signed divorce papers Julian's lawyer, a man with a ruthlessly tailored suit and an equally sharp smile, had hand-delivered just an hour after she'd given birth to their daughter Lily. The ink, a bold, unforgiving black, felt like a brand on her soul. Julian Croft. The man whose name was synonymous with tech innovation and old money. The man who had vowed to love her in sickness and in health, had chosen this moment, the most vulnerable, most sacred moment of her life, to sever their ties. He hadn't even bothered to show up. No call, no text, just a legal document delivered with the cold efficiency of a death sentence. Her fingers, still slightly swollen, traced the delicate features of the baby, sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside her. Lily, a name they had chosen together during a happier time. A time when Julian's laughter wasn't a hollow echo in her memory. She had his dark, silken hair and the same determined set to her tiny chin. A painful, beautiful reminder of the man who was now a ghost. The reason for his spectral presence had a name, Isabella Rossi, a name that dripped with the kind of exotic allure Amelia, a girl from a quiet suburban town, felt she could never compete with. Isabella was an art gallery owner, a woman who moved through the world with a confident, predatory grace, her social media a curated gallery of exclusive parties, European vacations, and intimate moments with Amelia's husband. The affair had been a poorly kept secret, a source of hushed gossip in their elite social circle, and a dagger that had been twisting in Amelia's heart for months. She had confronted him, of course. He had fed her the classic, pathetic lines it meant nothing. It was just a fling. They were working through a rough patch. He'd sworn it was over, that Amelia and the baby were his future. She, desperate to believe in the man she loved, had clung to those lies like a life raft. Now the wreckage of their marriage was all around her, and the life raft had dissolved into splinters. A nurse, a kind-faced woman named Clara, bustled in her presence, a small comfort in the sterile room. "How are our two lovely ladies doing?" she asked, her voice soft. Amelia forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. We're okay." Clara's eyes flickered to the legal documents on the bedside table, and then back to Amelia's pale face, a knowing sadness in her gaze. She'd seen this story play out in different forms too many times. "You have a beautiful, healthy daughter, my dear. That's a miracle right there. You focus on that." The advice was sound, but it was like telling a drowning person to appreciate the view. All Amelia could see was the abyss. Her family had disowned her for marrying Julian, whose family saw her as a gold-digging commoner. She had dropped out of her master's program, at his insistence becoming the perfect corporate wife. Her world had been Julian. Now her world was this tiny, four-walled room, and a future that was a terrifying, gaping void. Meanwhile, across the city, Julian Croft adjusted his tie in the reflection of his penthouse window. The glittering skyline of the city sprawling beneath him like a conquered kingdom. He felt a pang of something he refused to identify as guilt. He'd instructed his lawyer, Marcus, to handle the hospital situation. It was cleaner that way. Less messy. Amelia was emotional dramatic. The birth would only amplify that. He needed a clean break. He was finally free. The thought should have been exhilarating. For months, the weight of his double life had been suffocating. The lies, the sneaking around, the constant fear of exposure. Now it was done. He had chosen. He had chosen Isabella. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. "It's done," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "The papers are delivered. I'm on my way over." There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than he expected. "Julian." Isabella's voice was different, not the sultry, welcoming purr he was used to. It was cool, distant. "We need to talk." "I know," he said, a touch of impatience in his tone. "We can talk at your place. I'll bring champagne. We're celebrating the first day of our new life." "No, Julian. I don't think you understand," she said, and he could hear the finality in her words, a door slamming shut from miles away. "There is no our new life. You need to listen to me very carefully. Do not come here." Julian's blood ran cold. This wasn't part of the plan. "What are you talking about, Izzy? This is what we wanted. I ended my marriage. For you. You ended your marriage on the day your wife gave birth to your child." She shot back, her voice now sharp as broken glass. "What kind of man does that?" He was stunned into silence. This was the woman who had reveled in their stolen weekends, who had mocked Amelia's provincial sensibilities, who had urged him to leave his boring life behind. "You said you wanted me to be free," he finally managed, his voice rising. "You said you couldn't be with a married man." "And I meant it," Isabella said, "but I thought I was dealing with a man, Julian, not a monster. I may be a lot of things, but I am not the kind of woman who builds her happiness on the wreckage of a new mother and her baby. I thought you would handle this with some semblance of decency, an ounce of class, but this is just cruel. It's disgusting." He could hear the genuine revulsion in her voice, and it terrified him. "Isabella, be reasonable. It's just timing. It had to be done." "No, it didn't have to be done like this," she said. "It shows me who you are. If you can do that to the mother of your newborn child, what would you do to me down the line when you get bored? I'm not interested in finding out. We're done, Julian. I mean it. Lose my number." The line went dead. Julian stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear, the silence screaming at him. He looked out at the city lights, but they no longer looked like a kingdom. They looked cold, indifferent, and impossibly far away. He had torched his own life, expecting to walk into a new, brighter one. But he had miscalculated. He had burned down his bridge to the past, only to find the bridge to the future had just been dynamited. He was standing in the smoldering ruins, utterly and completely alone. The silence in the penthouse was a physical entity. It pressed in on Julian, heavy and suffocating. For the first time in his life, the vast open-plan space, with its floor-to-ceiling windows, felt like a tool where he had orchestrated what he believed to be the masterstroke of his personal life, a seamless transition from a stale marriage to a passionate future. Instead, he had written himself into a tragedy of his own making. Isabella's rejection was a blindside, a twist he hadn't accounted for in any of his calculated scenarios. He paced the length of the marble floor, his mind racing, trying to find a loophole, a way to fix this. He redialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again, and again. The same automated voice, a cold digital tombstone on their affair. He sent a flurry of texts, a desperate cascade of, "I love you, we can fix this, and please just talk to me." The single grey tick of non-delivery was his only reply. She had blocked him. Panic and unfamiliar and unwelcome emotion began to claw at his throat. He, Julian Croft, a man who bent the world to his will, had been summarily dismissed, discarded. The irony was a bitter pill. He had treated Amelia as disposable, and in turn Isabella had done the same to him. His mind, a weapon of logic and strategy in the boardroom, was failing him now. It kept replaying Isabella's words. "What kind of man does that? I thought I was dealing with a man, not a monster." The judgment in her voice was more damning than any court verdict. She hadn't just left him. She had passed a moral sentence on him. And in the stark, lonely quiet of his self-imposed exile, he was beginning to suspect she was right. A sudden jarring thought pierced through his self-pity. The baby. Lily. His daughter. He hadn't even seen her. In his haste to begin his new life, he had treated her birth as an inconvenience, a final messy loose end to be tidied away by his lawyer. He scrolled through his phone past the blocked contact for Isabella and hesitated over Amelia's number. What would he even say? "Sorry for the divorce papers. How's the baby I haven't bothered to meet?" His pride warred with a nascent, terrifying sense of regret. He was Julian Croft. He didn't beg. He didn't grovel. But the image of that cold, sterile hospital room, a place he should have been, gnawed at him. He had abandoned his wife, yes. But in doing so, he had also abandoned his own child on the day of her birth. The weight of it settled on him, a crushing physical burden. He sank onto a ludicrously expensive Italian leather sofa that suddenly felt as comfortable as a bed of nails. He had blown up his entire life for a woman who now saw him as a monster. And in the process he had become one. Back in the hospital, Amelia was visited by an unlikely ally. The door to her room swished open, and a woman stood there, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey power suit, her expression unreadable. It was Victoria Croft, Julian's older sister. Amelia's heart sank. She braced herself for an onslaught of accusations for the classic Croft condescension. Victoria had never approved of her making it clear from day one that Amelia was not their kind. "Victoria Amelia," said, her voice barely a whisper, pulling the thin hospital blanket a little higher, as if for protection. Victoria's sharp eyes took in the scene, the sleeping baby, the divorce papers still on the table, Amelia's exhausted pallor. She stepped fully into the room, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum. She didn't look at Amelia. Her gaze was fixed on the bassinet. "So this is her, Victoria," said her voice surprisingly soft. She moved closer, peering down at Lily. A flicker of something unidentifiable crossed her face. "She looks like a Croft. That stubborn chin. Our father had it." Amelia didn't know how to respond. This was not the attack she had anticipated. Victoria finally turned her gaze to Amelia, and for the first time, Amelia didn't see judgment in her sister-in-law's eyes. She saw a weary resignation and perhaps a hint of shame. "I just came from Julian's." "Victoria," said her tone clipped and businesslike. "He's not well. It seems the Bella Signora Rossi decided my brother's brand of cruelty wasn't to her taste." She kicked him to the curb. Amelia stared at her, stunned. Isabella had left him. The news didn't bring the surge of vindictive pleasure she might have expected. It just added another layer of surrealism to the nightmare. He told me what he did. Victoria continued, her voice laced with disdain. Having Marcus serve you papers. Here. Today. It's a new low even for him. I came here to say, I'm sorry, Amelia. No one deserves that. Our family. We haven't been fair to you. I haven't been fair to you. The apology hung in the air, so unexpected it felt like a foreign language. And Victoria's gaze hardened. I'm here to tell you that we will not be abandoning you or this child. My brother might be a fool and a coward, but that baby is a Croft. My niece. She will have everything she needs. I will personally see to it. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a checkbook. I've already frozen Julian's access to the family trust. His little stunt will cost him dearly. This is for your immediate expenses. Find the best postnatal care, a new place to live, whatever you need. A proper legal team, not the shark Julian hired, will be in touch tomorrow to discuss your settlement. You will not be left with nothing. Amelia was speechless, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't about the money. It was the validation, the acknowledgement. It was the sight of this formidable woman who had always looked down on her, now standing as her fierce protector. Why, Amelia finally choked out. Victoria looked back at the sleeping baby, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. Because I have spent years watching my brother make selfish, destructive choices. I enabled it. We all did. We let him get away with it because he was the golden boy. But this, she gestured around the room. This ends now, and because that little girl deserves a better family than the one she was born into, and it's my job to make sure she gets it. She looked at Amelia, a steely resolve in her eyes. Get some rest. Heal. Get strong. You're going to need it. We're going to make him regret this. Not out of spite. Out of principle. As Victoria turned and walked out, leaving a stunned Amelia and a check with an astronomical number of zeros on the bedside table. The world outside the hospital room began to shift. The battle lines, once so clearly drawn, were being redrawn in the most unexpected ways. This was no longer just about a failed marriage. It was about to become a war for the soul of the Croft family. And Amelia, the abandoned wife, had just been handed the most powerful weapon of all the unwavering support of her enemy. The days that followed were a blur of logistics and quiet healing for Amelia. True to her word, Victoria Croft became a force of nature, a whirlwind of controlled, efficient fury. A team of lawyers, a discreet but formidable trio from a top-tier family law firm, replaced the predatory shark Julian had sent. They spoke to Amelia with respect, outlining a strategy that was less about a settlement and more about a strategic dismantling of Julian's assets. Victoria has been clear, said the lead attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Eleanor Vance. This isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring the long-term security of you and Lily, and about holding Julian accountable for his fiduciary and moral failures to his family. A luxury postpartum recovery suite was booked, a place that felt more like a 5-star hotel than a medical facility. Nannies were interviewed, a temporary security detail was arranged, and a real estate agent was dispatched to find a suitable, unassailable new home. Amelia, who had felt so utterly adrift, was now surrounded by a fortress of support, all orchestrated by the last person she ever expected to be in her corner. She found herself in the strange position of being the calm center of a storm she hadn't started. While lawyers waged war on her behalf, she focused on Lily. She learned the rhythms of her daughter's needs, the soft gurgles, the tiny, grasping fingers, the milky scent of her skin. In the quiet of the night, holding her sleeping child, the pain of Julian's betrayal was still a raw, open wound. But now it was accompanied by a burgeoning sense of strength. She wasn't just a victim, she was a mother, and she had powerful allies. One afternoon, as she was rocking Lily to sleep, her new encrypted phone buzzed, an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Amelia. The voice was tentative female and vaguely familiar. Who is this? It's Isabella Rossi. Amelia's blood ran cold. Her hand tightened on the phone. What do you want? She asked, her voice tight with a mix of anger and dread. I know I am the last person you want to hear from, Isabella, began her voice strained, and I don't expect you to believe me or forgive me. God knows I don't deserve it. But I needed to call. I needed to say, I am so sorry. For everything. Amelia was silent, her mind reeling. I'm not calling to make excuses, Isabella continued, her voice cracking slightly. What I did was wrong. I was selfish, and I was foolish. I let myself believe a fantasy Julian spun, and I ignored the reality of the damage we were causing. When I found out what he did, how he did it, serving you papers in the hospital, it was like a bucket of ice water. It woke me up. I saw the man I had been involved with for who he truly was. And I was disgusted with him, but mostly I was disgusted with myself. She took a shaky breath. I've been doing some thinking about everything, and I've been talking to some people. There are things about Julian, things you should know, things that go beyond what he did to you and me. A chill went down Amelia's spine. What things? His business dealings. The Croft family trust is old and complicated. Victoria controls a large part of it, but Julian has his own ventures. He's been making some very risky, very questionable investments, using leverage in ways that could jeopardize not just his own finances, but the entire family's legacy. I overheard things, saw documents I shouldn't have seen on his laptop. I didn't understand them at the time, but now. She trailed off. He's desperate. That's why he was so eager to lock me down, I think. He thought my family's connections in the art world could be a lifeline for him. He's not just a faithless husband, Amelia. He's a reckless gambler, and he's about to lose the whole house. Amelia didn't know what to say. This revelation was a paradigm shift. Why are you telling me this? Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Because he used both of us, Isabella said, a new hard edge to her voice. He used your love and your stability as a cover, and he used my ambition and connections as his next escape hatch. And he was going to discard us both when we were no longer useful. He abandoned you and your child, and I helped him. That's a stain on my soul I'll never be able to wash away. But maybe I can help make sure he doesn't get away with it. Maybe I can give you the ammunition you need to protect yourself and your daughter. There was a long pause. I have copies, Isabella said quietly, of emails, bank transfers, offshore account information. I shouldn't have them, but I do. They're yours if you want them. Julian, meanwhile, was experiencing the slow, agonizing process of his world shrinking. The freeze on the family trust was a crippling blow. His personal accounts, while substantial, were heavily leveraged against assets he could no longer touch. Calls from his brokers became more frequent. their voices tinged with a nervous edge. The market had taken a downturn, and the high-risk tech ventures he had poured millions into were suddenly looking less like genius investments and more like black holes. He was a pariah. Friends who had once clamored for his company now sent his calls to voicemail. The invitations stopped arriving. He was a man tainted by scandal, not the salacious, exciting kind, but the ugly, pathetic kind. He had committed the ultimate sin in their world. He had been publicly and humiliatingly rejected. He tried to see Victoria to reason with her, but she refused his calls and barred him from the family estate. He was an outcast. One evening, fueled by expensive whiskey and a potent cocktail of rage and self-pity, he did the one thing he swore he wouldn't. He drove to the hospital, not the main entrance, but the discreet exit of the luxury postnatal wing he knew Victoria would have booked. He didn't know what he planned to do. See the baby. Confront Amelia. He just knew he couldn't stand the crushing isolation of his penthouse a moment longer. He saw her. Amelia. She was getting into a black town car, a driver holding the door. She looked different, stronger, more composed than he had seen her in years. There was a quiet dignity in her posture that unnerved him. She was holding a baby carrier, and for a fleeting moment he saw a tiny hand wave in the air. His daughter. A primal surge of possession of rage coursed through him. That was his wife, his child, his life, stolen from him. He got out of his car and strode towards them. Amelia. She froze her hand on the car door and turned. Her eyes widened not with fear, but with a cold, hard clarity. The security guard, a large, imposing man, immediately stepped between them. Mr. Croft, the guard said, his voice a low rumble, I'd advise you to stay back. This is my wife and my child. Julian spat, his voice raw. I have a right to see them. You surrendered that right. Amelia's voice cut through the air, clear and steady, devoid of the tremor he expected. You had your lawyer make that very clear. You are not to come near me or my daughter. He looked past the guard directly at her, his face a mask of desperation. Amelia, please. We need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding. Victoria is trying to ruin me. That woman, Isabella, she's a liar. Amelia gave a small, sad shake of her head. No, Julian. For the first time, everything is perfectly clear. I know about the investments. I know about the shell corporations. I know everything. The blood drained from Julian's face. How could she know? You didn't just abandon your family. Amelia said, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who held all the cards. You were prepared to gamble it away. You were never building a future with me or with her. You were just looking for your next bailout. She gave a curt nod to the security guard. We're leaving. As she slipped into the car, she gave him one last look, a look not of a spurned wife, but of a judge delivering a final verdict. It was a look of pity. The car pulled away, leaving Julian standing on the curb, the guard watching him like a hawk. The whiskey buzz had evaporated, replaced by the icy chill of pure terror. She knew, which meant Victoria knew, which meant Eleanor Vance and her team of legal assassins knew. It wasn't just his marriage that was over. It was his entire world. And he had handed his enemies the matches and the gasoline to burn it to the ground. The documents Isabella provided were the key. Laid out on the polished mahogany table of Eleanor Vance's conference room The printouts of offshore accounts, encrypted emails, and leveraged loan agreements painted a picture not just of marital infidelity, but of massive, potentially criminal financial malfeasance. Victoria Croft sat at the head of the table, her face a grim mask of resolve. Amelia sat to her right, Lily sleeping peacefully in a state-of-the-art stroller nearby. For the first time, Amelia felt like a participant in her own life again, not just a passenger. Isabella, accompanied by her own lawyer, sat opposite them, looking pale but determined. It was the most unlikely war council ever assembled. He used the Croft family name as collateral for these loans, Eleanor explained, tapping a highlighted paragraph. Without the board's approval, he moved funds through a series of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands, essentially borrowing from himself on paper to inflate the liquidity of his tech startups. It's a house of cards, and from the looks of this market projection, the wind is picking up. He was planning to use a merger with a European art conglomerate to hide the debt, Isabella added quietly. My father has a seat on their board. Julian was very insistent on meeting him. I see now it wasn't about me. It was about access. Victoria's knuckles were white as she gripped her pen. My father built an empire on integrity. My brother has used our name, our legacy, to build a fantasy on a foundation of lies. He has risked everything. Her gaze shifted to Amelia, then to the sleeping baby. Everything he was meant to protect. What does this mean legally? Amelia asked, her voice steady. It means, Eleanor said, a glint in her eye, that we are no longer just negotiating a divorce settlement. We are now in a position to reclaim assets that were fraudulently misappropriated from the family trust. In essence, we can prove that much of what Julian considers his money is in fact stolen property. It gives us leverage to strip him of his board seat, his voting rights, and a significant portion of his personal net worth to cover the debts he has incurred against the family name. It was a total financial annihilation, a complete checkmate. Victoria nodded slowly. Do it. As the meeting concluded and the lawyers began drafting the motions, a strange sense of solidarity hung in the room. Victoria placed a hand on Amelia's shoulder. You are doing the right thing, Amelia, for your daughter. You are protecting her future. Then she turned to Isabella. The air crackled with tension. Miss Rosie Victoria, said her voice formal, but no longer dripping with ice. You did not have to do this. You could have simply walked away. Why? Isabella met her gaze directly. Because your brother reminded me of my own father, she said, her voice low and laced with an old pain. A charming man who builds a world for his family and then becomes reckless with it. My mother paid the price for his mistakes. I helped Julian become the kind of man I've always despised. This is my penance and my warning, for Amelia and for her daughter, so she never has to pay the price for her father's sins. The confession, raw and unexpected, changed the atmosphere in the room. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about three women all wronged by the same man, now united in a common cause. For Julian, the fallout was swift and brutal. It began with a summons delivered to his penthouse by a stoic process server. It wasn't just a divorce filing. It was a comprehensive lawsuit from the Croft family trust, with his own sister as the lead plaintiff. The allegations were laid out in cold black-and-white detail. Fraud, misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty. His bankers, who had once courted him, now treated him like a contagion. His lines of credit were frozen. Margin calls came one after another, each one a hammer blow to his crumbling financial empire. The tech startup, starved of the fraudulent capital he'd been pumping into them, began to fold. The house of cards was collapsing in on itself, exactly as Eleanor Vance had predicted. He was trapped. Every asset he tried to liquidate was already encumbered by the lawsuit. He was a millionaire on paper, but in reality, he was broke. He had to sell his sports car to cover his initial legal fees. He let his housekeeping staff go. The penthouse, once a symbol of his power, became a dusty, silent prison. The panoramic views of the city were a constant mocking reminder of the world he had lost. Desperate, he tried to rally support from old business partners, but the Croft name, wielded by Victoria, was a weapon he could not defend against. She was systematically dismantling his reputation, cutting him off from every source of power and influence he had ever cultivated. He was left with nothing but his own hubris. He started drinking earlier and earlier in the day, the expensive whiskey his only companion. He would stare at the few photos he had of Amelia from their early happy years. He tried to pinpoint the exact moment it had all gone wrong, the single decision that had led him to this ruin. Was it meeting Isabella? Was it the first lie he told? Or was it something deeper, a flaw in his own character, that had been there all along? One night, in a drunken haze, he found himself scrolling through a gossip blog on his phone. And then he saw it, a picture of Amelia walking in a park. She was pushing a stroller, laughing at something someone off camera had said. She looked radiant, beautiful, and utterly at peace. Beside her, holding a shopping bag and smiling, was Isabella Rossi. And walking on Amelia's other side, pointing at something in the distance for the baby to see, was his sister, Victoria. The caption read, "New Power Trio." Amelia Croft. Victoria Croft and former rival Isabella Rossi form an unlikely alliance, proving that sisterhood is powerful, and hell hath no fury like 3 women scorned. Julian stared at the image, his world tilting on its axis. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It wasn't just about money. They had formed a new family. A family built from the ashes of the one he had destroyed, and he was not and would never be a part of it. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had not just lost his wife, his mistress, his fortune, and his family. He had lost his place in the world. He had sought ultimate freedom and had found himself in the ultimate prison, a solitary confinement of his own making. The laughter in that photo, the easy camaraderie, the life he could have had. It was a paradise, and he was the angel who had been permanently cast out. He finally understood the true nature of his loss. He had given up everything for nothing, and in doing so, had lost himself. The screen of the tablet cracked under the force of Julian's grip before he hurled it across the room. It shattered against a marble column, the image of the 3 smiling women, his wife, his sister, his mistress dissolving into a spiderweb of broken glass. The sound echoed in the cavernous, empty penthouse, a fitting soundtrack to the demolition of his life. He sank to the floor, the expensive whiskey doing nothing to numb the new terrifying clarity. The photo hadn't just shown him what he had lost. It had shown him that he had been replaced, utterly and completely. In his self-imposed drama, he had always been the protagonist. Now he saw the truth. He was merely the catalyst, the villain in the origin story of a new, unexpected alliance. They hadn't just moved on. They had evolved, bonding over his destruction and building something stronger in his place. The loneliness was a physical entity, a cold, heavy presence in the room. He had sought freedom and had achieved only isolation. He had chased passion and was left with ashes. For days he barely moved the penthouse, growing darker and dustier around him, a mausoleum for the man he used to be. The legal notices piled up unopened. The finality was too much to bear. One rain-slicked afternoon, driven by a desperation that transcended pride, he took a taxi to the address he'd gleaned for Amelia's new residence. It was a stately, discreet brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. He stood across the street, drenched and disheveled, a ghost at the gates of a life that was no longer his. He didn't know what he wanted. Forgiveness. A fight to see his daughter. He just knew he couldn't bear the silence any longer. The front door opened, but it wasn't Amelia who emerged. It was Victoria. She held a large black umbrella, her posture as rigid and unyielding as ever. She saw him instantly, her expression not of surprise, but of weary inevitability. She crossed the street, her heels clicking with resolute purpose on the wet pavement, and stopped a few feet from him. "Go home, Julian," she said, her voice flat, devoid of heat. It was worse than anger. It was indifference. "I want to see her," he croaked, his voice raw. "Amelia. And the baby. Her name is Lily." Victoria corrected him coldly. "And no, you will not see them. You gave up that right. Remember Victoria, please." He begged the word, tasting like acid in his mouth. He was Julian Croft. He did not beg. But he was no longer that man. "You're my sister. This is my family." A flicker of something pain, regret, disgust crossed her face. "Family. You used our family's name to commit fraud. You brought shame and scandal to a legacy our father spent his life building. You abandoned your wife on the day she gave birth to your child. That is not what family does. You are a liability we have cut loose." She reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. "The board has reached a final decision. In exchange for you relinquishing all claims, all titles, and your name from any future business, and to avoid criminal prosecution, which I assure you you would not survive the trust, has allocated you a one-time final payment. It's enough for you to disappear and live quietly. But it is not enough for you to ever be Julian Croft again." She pushed the envelope into his hand. "This is the last thing you will ever receive from us. Do not contact me again. Do not try to see Amelia or Lily again. Legal measures have been taken. You are now, for all intents and purposes, a stranger to us." She turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving him standing in the rain, clutching the envelope that was both his salvation and his life sentence. He had been officially, irrevocably erased. A year later, the Croft Rossi Foundation for Women and Children was celebrating its first anniversary with a gala. The ballroom was filled with the city's most influential figures, but the center of attention was the three women on the stage. Victoria, in her role as chairwoman, spoke of financial literacy and empowerment. Isabella, head of outreach, spoke of creating safe spaces and second chances. And then Amelia, the foundation's president, stepped to the podium. She looked poised, her voice clear and strong as she spoke of resilience, of turning pain into purpose. A year ago, she said, her eyes sweeping across the room. Many of us in this room, myself included, learned that the lives we planned are not always the lives we get. But we also learned that your greatest strength is not found when things are easy. It is forged in the fire. It is discovered when you have no choice but to stand up, not just for yourself, but for those who cannot yet stand for themselves. In the front row, a nanny held a giggling one-year-old Lily who clapped her hands, her dark hair, a familiar echo. Across town, in a small, clean apartment, that was utterly anonymous. Julian Croft watched the gala on a local news broadcast. He was sober thinner, haunted by a quiet that had become his constant companion. He saw Amelia on the screen, a woman he barely recognized. The timid, accommodating girl he had married was gone, replaced by this confident, powerful leader. He saw the genuine admiration in the faces of his sister and his former lover as they looked at her. He had orchestrated his own downfall so spectacularly that he had inadvertently created his own replacement, a better version of the world he'd left behind. They were everything he wasn't, united, purposeful, and content. As Amelia finished her speech to a standing ovation, Julian quietly turned off the television, plunging his small apartment into darkness. There was nothing left to watch. His story was over. Hers was just beginning. 5 years passed. 5 years of sense of atonement, of erasure. In a dreary, anonymous city hundreds of miles from the glittering spires of his past, Julian Croft had ceased to exist. In his place was John Anderson, a man who managed shipping logistics with quiet competence, lived in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, and spoke to almost no one. The severance from the Croft Trust, a sum that would seem a fortune to most, but was a pittance to him, was managed with a miser's care. It was his penance, and he lived it every day. He had kept his promise. He had vanished. But while the world had forgotten Julian Croft, the man who was once him could not. The ghost of his daughter was his constant, silent companion. He marked her birthdays on a plain wall calendar, the only decoration in his sterile living space. On those days, he would buy a single pink frosted cupcake from a local bakery place, a candle in it, and watch it burn down the flame reflected in his haunted eyes. He imagined the parties, the gifts, the laughter he would never be a part of. He followed the Croft-Rossi Foundation's progress with the obsessive dedication of a zealot. He learned to navigate the internet through proxies and anonymous accounts, finding obscure local news coverage of their charity, galas, studying photos from the events. He saw his Amelia transform. The tentative woman he had married was gone, replaced by a leader of formidable grace and confidence. He felt a strange, hollowed-out pride that ached like a phantom limb, mingled with the ever-present burn of regret. He even made small, anonymous donations to the foundation wiring funds through a labyrinth of accounts, a pathetic secret tithe paid to the family he had forsaken. One crisp autumn afternoon, his carefully constructed exile was breached by an accident of fate. A rare, unavoidable business trip brought him back to his former city. He told himself he would stay in his hotel, that he wouldn't tempt the ghosts of his past. But an irresistible force pulled him, and he found himself walking through a park, the very park near the brownstone he knew Amelia called home. He told himself it was a coincidence, a trick of a lonely mind. But then he saw them. Amelia was sitting on a bench, her head tilted back as she laughed, the sound carried towards him on the breeze. It was the same genuine, unburdened laugh he remembered from their earliest days, a sound he thought he had killed forever. Running on the grass, her small form silhouetted against the fiery golds and reds of the autumn leaves, was a little girl with his own dark, silken hair and the same determined set to her tiny chin. Lily, no longer the infant in his memory, but a vibrant, living, breathing person. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled backward, pressing himself against the rough bark of an ancient oak tree, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a spectator at the premiere of a life that should have been his. He watched as Lily, chasing a swirling eddy of leaves, tripped and fell. A small cry of surprise, not pain, escaped her. In an instant, Amelia was there, scooping her up, her movements fluid, with the easy practice of motherhood. She knelt on the grass, whispering comforts, kissing a knee that wasn't really scraped, and within seconds, the little girl's tears turned to giggles. The scene was so simple, so perfect, so devastatingly ordinary. It was every mundane moment of fatherhood he had willingly forfeited. This, he realized with a clarity that was a new circle of hell, was the true fortune he had squandered. Not the money, not the power, but this. The right to kiss a scraped knee. He stayed hidden until they packed up their things and walked away hand in hand, their figures shrinking in the fading light. He was a phantom left alone in the dusk, the image of his daughter's smiling face burned into his soul. The sterile silence of his hotel room was a roaring torment. The encounter had shattered his fragile, monotonous peace. For 5 years he had accepted his punishment, believing his absence was a necessary sacrifice. But seeing her had changed the calculus. He was her father. Did she even know he existed? Or was he just a vague, monstrous shadow in her story? The thought of her growing up hating a man she'd never met, a villain in a story she didn't understand, was a torture beyond anything he had yet endured. He could not storm back into their lives. He had no right. But could he live the rest of his life as nothing more than a ghost? He found a pen and a cheap notepad from the hotel desk and began to write. It was not a demand or a plea, but a confession. The first few pages were stilted, full of false starts. But then something broke within him, and the words began to pour out, a torrent of memory and regret. He wrote for weeks, first in the hotel, then back in his apartment, the pages piling up. He wrote of his own father, a cold, demanding man who equated love with success. He wrote of the crushing weight of the Croft name, of feeling like an imposter in his own life. He did not offer these as excuses, but as a desperate attempt at context. He wrote about Isabella, describing the affair not as a grand passion, but as a cowardly escape from a marriage he didn't have the courage to either fix or end honorably. And then, with searing, self-lacerating detail, he wrote about the day of Lily's birth. He confessed his terror, his moral cowardice, the selfish, catastrophic miscalculation that had cost him everything. He wrote of seeing his daughter in the park 5 years later, of the overwhelming, unconditional love that had ambushed him, a pure, painful emotion, untainted by the pride or possession that had defined his old life. He ended the manuscript, for it had become one with a simple, terrifying proposition. I do not ask for your forgiveness, Amelia. I have no right to it, and I will not force myself into Lily's life. I surrendered that right forever. But I ask you to consider this: one day she will have questions, and I have written the truth for her. It is an ugly, shameful truth, but it is a part of her story. I am sending this to your lawyer, Eleanor Vance. It is for you to keep to burn, to share with Lily when you feel the time is right, or to ignore completely. I will abide by your decision, whatever it may be, without protest. That is my final promise. I simply want her to know, if you ever choose to let her, that her father, for all his monstrous faults, loved her enough to finally tell her the truth. He packaged the thick manuscript and sent it to Eleanor's office. The act felt like leaping from a cliff into a dark, unknown sea. He had relinquished the last vestige of control he possessed, placing his legacy as a father entirely into the hands of the woman he had wronged most of all. A week later, Amelia sat in the quiet of her study, the city a distant, glittering tapestry below. The thick parcel from Eleanor lay on her polished desk. She had stared at it for a full day, before finally slitting it open. her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a curiosity she hated to admit. As she read, her carefully constructed composure began to disintegrate. The Julian in these pages was not the charming man she'd once loved, nor was he the one-dimensional monster who had abandoned her. This was a man stripped bare, his soul laid out in unflinching, excruciating detail. His words were not manipulative. They were a raw, brutal autopsy of his own character. She saw not a villain, but a tragic, deeply flawed human being, a product of a gilded cage she had never fully understood. The fortress she had built around her heart trembled. For 5 years, the story of Lily's father had been a simple, necessary one. He was a man who had made bad choices and had to go away. But this letter, this confession, shattered that simplicity. Lily, asleep in her room down the hall, deserved the truth, didn't she? But was this a truth that would heal her, or a poison that would curdle the perfect, safe world Amelia, Victoria, and Isabella had so painstakingly built for her? She held the letter, the sheer physical weight of it immense. She knew she could not make this decision alone. The next day, she called a meeting, not in a boardroom, but in her sun-drenched living room. Victoria and Isabella sat opposite her, their expressions shifting from curiosity to stunned gravity as Amelia explained the arrival of the manuscript. "He wants nothing." Amelia finished, her voice unsteady. "No contact, no visitation. Just to be known. On my terms." Victoria, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. "Burn it," she said, her voice clipped resolute. "Amelia, we have spent 5 years building a world for Lily that is safe and stable. A world without his chaos. Why would you invite the ghost back into the house? He is a story, a sad one, but one that is finished. Let it stay that way, that way." "But is it finished?" Isabella countered softly, her eyes full of a familiar pain. "My father, he was never capable of this kind of honesty. I spent my life wishing he would just once explain himself, even if the explanation was ugly. A lie, even a kind one, is a cage. This manuscript, it might be a key for Lily, a way for her to understand a part of herself without having to endure the man himself." "You're romanticizing him," Victoria shot back. "This is a man who committed fraud, who abandoned his child. And he admits to it all in his own words," Isabella insisted, leaning forward. "That's the point. He isn't hiding. For the first time, he's not hiding. Don't you see the power in that giving Lily the truth when she is old enough lets her be the judge? It trusts her." Amelia listened, her head spinning. Victoria was offering protection. Isabella was offering truth. Both were born of love for Lily. She looked from one to the other, the two women who had become her rocks, her sisters. They had helped her slay the dragon, but now his voice was echoing from the past, and they were divided on how to answer. Her story, she had thought, was over. His was over. But she realized with a dawning, terrifying clarity that as long as they had a child, their stories would forever be intertwined. And Julian Croft, the ghost she had banished, was asking for one last thing. The choice to shield her daughter within the perfect safety of their world, or to arm her with a complex and painful truth, was hers alone. And as she looked towards the hallway where her daughter slept, she had no idea what to do. In the end, Julian Croft, the man who thought he could discard people like last season's assets, was left with only the echoes of his own bad decisions. He lost more than a fortune. He lost the future. This story serves as a powerful, raw reminder that integrity is the one currency you can't afford to go bankrupt on. The bonds between Amelia Victoria and even Isabella, forged in the fires of betrayal, created a new kind of family, one built on strength, resilience, and mutual respect. They didn't just survive. They thrived. The air on the billion-dollar yacht. Serafina tasted of salt and secrets. Tonight, under a diamond-dusted moon, self-made magnate Adrian Petrov was celebrating a deal that would cement his legacy. His powerful friends, dripping in jewels and false smiles, toasted his genius with flutes of Dom Perignon. But they were all oblivious. They didn't know the real celebration was a sham. They didn't know that miles away, Adrian's pregnant wife, Isabella, was staring at two blue lines on a test her heart, hammering with a truth that would shatter this perfect illusion. And they certainly didn't know she was on her way to crash this party, carrying the one secret Adrian couldn't control, his hidden heir. The Mediterranean moon was a flawless pearl suspended in a velvet sky, its light spilling across the impossibly blue waters of the Côte d'Azur. It illuminated the striking silhouette of the Serafina, a 300-foot monument to modern opulence, anchored just far enough from the twinkling lights of Monaco to feel like a private kingdom. On its decks, a carefully curated guest list of Europe's elite mingled. There were tech barons with boyish faces and predatory eyes, aging aristocrats clinging to their titles and supermodels, whose beauty was both a currency and a cage. They were all orbiting one man, the sun, around which their gilded world turned tonight, Adrian Petrov. Adrian was a man carved from ambition, with a jawline as sharp as his business acumen and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He possessed a charisma that was both magnetic and menacing. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, his hand-tailored Tom Ford suit clinging to his athletic frame. He'd shake a hand, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, and murmur a perfectly pitched pleasantry that made the recipient feel seen, yet simultaneously assessed and dismissed. Tonight he was celebrating the successful acquisition of a rival tech firm, a move the financial papers were calling a masterstroke of corporate woofer. To Adrian, the man who doesn't just climb mountains, he buys them. A Russian oligarch with a booming laugh raised his glass. The crowd roared its approval. Flutes of Dom Perignon, the 2008 vintage, were raised in a glittering salute. The champagne, crisp and effervescent, was a fitting symbol for the evening expensive bubbly and ultimately empty. Adrian acknowledged the toast with a practiced nod, the picture of magnanimous success. But beneath the veneer of triumph, a cold coil of unease was tightening in his gut. The celebration felt premature. The deal was done, but the real victory he sought was still hanging in the balance, a delicate negotiation of a far more personal nature. He scanned the faces on the yacht, a sea of transactional relationships. These weren't friends. They were assets, allies, and potential threats. Every smile was a calculation, every compliment a down payment on a future favor. Miles away in the palatial villa that perched on the cliffs overlooking the sea, Isabella Petrov felt the chill that had nothing to do with the mansion's aggressive air conditioning. The house was a marvel of modern architecture, all glass, white, marble, and minimalist furniture. It was featured in magazines, a testament to Adrian's exquisite taste. But to Isabella it was a beautiful, sterile prison. The silence within its walls was a living thing, broken only by the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below. She stood in the center of their cavernous bathroom, the marble cool beneath her bare feet. In her trembling hand, she held the positive pregnancy test, the third one she had taken that day. Each one had delivered the same stark, terrifying, and wondrous verdict. 2 blue lines, a baby. Adrian's baby. A wave of nausea, one that had become her constant companion for the past 6 weeks, washed over her. But this time, it was laced with a dawning horror. For the past 6 weeks, she had also been living with a growing, shapeless dread. Adrian had been distant his nights away from home, more frequent his explanations for his absences, vague and slick with a corporate jargon she could no longer pretend to understand. He'd told her this trip to Monaco was a solo affair, a boys' club trip to finalize the deal. "It would bore you to tears, my love." He had said, his kiss a cool, fleeting pressure on her forehead. She had wanted to believe him. For 2 years she had played the part of the perfect wife, elegant, supportive, and blissfully incurious. She had stood by his side at countless galas, her smile as practiced as his. She had learned to ignore the whispers of the other wives, the pitying glances that lingered a moment too long. She had convinced herself that the coldness in their marriage was simply the price of his ambition, that the man she had fallen in love with, the passionate, driven man who had swept her off her feet, was still there, buried beneath layers of wealth and power. But the 2 blue lines changed everything. This was no longer about her loneliness or her suspicions. This was about a child. Her child. A child who deserved a father, not a phantom. A child who deserved more than a life in a gilded cage. The final straw had come an hour ago. A stray email left open on Adrian's tablet. It was from his personal assistant, a woman whose efficiency was matched only by her icy loyalty. The subject line was, "Monaco Celebration Logistics." Isabella's finger had hovered over the screen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She knew she shouldn't look. She knew that crossing this line was an act of marital treason from which there was no return. But the need to know the gnawing emptiness of the unknown was a physical force. She opened it. The email contained a detailed itinerary for the yacht party. The guest list, the catering menu from a Michelin-starred chef, the specific vintage of the champagne. And at the bottom, a note that made the blood freeze in her veins. Remise Dubois's arrival. Please ensure she is brought directly to the master suite upon boarding. Mr. Petrov wishes to speak with her, privately, before the other guests arrive. Discretion is paramount. Miss Dubois. Chloe Dubois. A name Isabella had seen before in the society pages, a Parisian art dealer with a reputation as formidable as her beauty. A name Adrian had mentioned once dismissively as a business acquaintance. The lie was so blatant, so insulting in its simplicity, that it shattered the last vestiges of Isabella's denial. The party wasn't just a business celebration. It was a lie. Her husband was a lie. A strange calm settled over her. The nausea receded, replaced by a steely resolve. She would not sit in this silent mausoleum while her husband celebrated his triumphs with another woman. She would not let her child be born into a world of secrets and deceit. She walked to her closet, a room the size of a small apartment filled with designer gowns she rarely had occasion to wear. She bypassed the vibrant silks and sparkling sequins, her hand settling on a simple, elegant gown of ivory crepe. It was understated, almost severe in its design, but it clung to her frame in a way that hinted at the new, gentle curve of her belly. She wouldn't hide it. Not anymore. She slipped on a pair of flat, pearl-adorned sandals, forgoing the stilettos, that felt like instruments of torture. She swept her dark hair back into a low, severe ponytail, her face pale but determined in the mirror. She looked like a woman going into battle. As she walked through the echoing halls of the villa, her handbag, a simple leather tote, a stark contrast to the diamond-encrusted clutches she usually carried, slung over her shoulder. She felt a flicker of the woman she used to be. A woman who had been a respected journalist, a woman who had her own voice, her own life before she had allowed herself to be absorbed into Adrian's world. She called for a taxi, not the chauffeured Mercedes that sat gleaming in the garage. She needed the anonymity, the sense of reclaiming a small piece of her independence. As the taxi wound its way down the cliffs towards the glittering lights of the marina, Isabella placed a protective hand over her stomach. The hidden heir. Adrian was on his yacht, celebrating a kingdom built on lies. He had no idea that the one thing that could bring it all crashing down was on its way, cradled safely in the womb of the wife he had so foolishly underestimated. The moonlit party was about to have an uninvited guest. The Port Hercules marina was a forest of gleaming white masts and polished chrome. The air buzzed with a different kind of energy than the silent cliffs. The thrum of engines, the murmur of multiple languages, the distant pulse of music from the various vessels celebrating the warm summer night. Isabella paid the taxi driver her hand steady as she stepped onto the polished cobblestones. In her simple ivory dress, she was an anomaly, a whisper of stark reality amidst the loud performance of wealth. She walked towards the main pier, her tote bag feeling heavier with every step. It contained her wallet, her phone, and the 3 pregnancy tests nestled in a silk pouch. They were her proof, her ammunition. Finding the Serafina was easy. It was the largest, most ostentatiously lit yacht in the harbor, a floating palace that seemed to sneer at the lesser vessels around it. A security team men in sharp suits with discreet earpieces stood at the gangplank. "May I help you, madam?" The head of security was built like a refrigerator, his expression professionally impassive. "I'm here to see my husband," Isabella said, her voice clear and calm. "Adrian Petrov." The man's eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible moment of confusion. He was clearly not expecting her. He glanced at his list, a tablet held in his meaty hand. "I'm sorry I don't have your name down, madame." "I'm sure you don't," Isabella replied, a hint of ice in her tone. "My name is Isabella Petrov. I am his wife. You can either let me on this boat, or I can start making a scene that will attract the attention of every paparazzo currently hiding in the shadows. Your choice." The guard's jaw tightened. He recognized the steely glint in her eyes, the unmistakable look of a woman who had nothing left to lose. He spoke quietly into his wrist. "Sir, we have a situation at the gangplank. A Mrs. Isabella Petrov is here." There was a pause. Isabella could imagine the frantic whispered conversation on the other end. She could picture Adrian's face, the mask of a charming host momentarily slipping to reveal the cold fury beneath. After a long moment, the guard nodded stiffly. "Go ahead, Mrs. Petrov." She walked up the gangplank, her flat sandals making a soft, defiant slap with each step. As she stepped onto the teak deck, it was as if she had walked through an invisible barrier. The vibrant soundscape of the party, the smooth jazz, the clinking glasses, the cacophony of self-important conversations seemed to falter. A ripple of silence spread outwards from her, a sudden jarring halt in the rhythm of the night. Heads turned. The music, as if on cue from a confused DJ, faded into an awkward silence. 100 pairs of eyes, a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and predatory glee fixed on her. She was the disruption they had all been secretly craving, a crack in the flawless facade of the evening. She saw the faces of Adrian's friends, their expressions morphing from feigned bonhomie to undisguised fascination. They smelled blood in the water. And then she saw him. Adrian was standing near the grand staircase leading to the upper deck, a flute of champagne in his hand, a beautiful raven-haired woman in a glittering scarlet dress by his side. Chloe Dubois, the art dealer. Her laughter tinkling and artificial died on her lips as she followed Adrian's gaze. Adrian's face was a masterpiece of control. For a split second, Isabella saw it all, the flash of pure, unadulterated rage, the icy panic, the frantic calculation. And then it was gone, smoothed over by a smile that was dazzling, predatory, and utterly false. He disengaged himself from Chloe Dubois, with a practiced ease, his hand leaving a brief proprietary touch on her arm, and began to walk towards Isabella. "Isabella, darling," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr that carried across the silent deck. "What a wonderful surprise. I thought you were feeling unwell." He reached her and placed a kiss on her cheek. It was as cold as a tombstone. His fingers gripped her arm, the pressure a painful, silent warning. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, his smile never wavering, his eyes boring into hers with a cold fire. "I felt better," Isabella said, her voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. She pulled her arm free from his grasp. "I couldn't bear the thought of you celebrating all alone." A nervous titter went through the crowd. They were hanging on every word, every gesture. This was better than theatre. "Well, the more the merrier," Adrian said, his charm engine working at full capacity. He slipped an arm around her waist, a gesture that looked possessive and romantic, but was in reality a vice, an attempt to control her, to steer her away from the center of attention. "Everyone," he announced, his voice booming with forced joviality, "I'd like you to properly greet my wonderful wife, Isabella. She decided to grace us with her presence after all." A scattered, awkward applause broke out. Chloe Dubois watched from the sidelines, her arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips. She looked less like a jilted lover and more like a spectator enjoying the opening act of a gladiatorial contest. Isabella let Adrian guide her for a few steps, playing the part of the dutiful wife. She could feel the tension thrumming through his body, the rage simmering just beneath the surface. He was trying to lead her towards a quiet corner, towards the shadows where he could contain this situation. But Isabella had not come here to be contained. She stopped in the very center of the main deck, directly under the brilliant glow of a crystal chandelier. She turned to face him, forcing him to stop with her. She placed her hand on his chest, a seemingly affectionate gesture that made him flinch. "Adrian, darling," she began, her voice ringing with a newfound theatrical clarity. "You're right. It was a surprise. But I had a surprise of my own that simply couldn't wait." She looked around at the sea of expectant faces, from the Russian oligarch to the sneering aristocrats. She held their gaze one by one, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension build until it was a palpable thing, a tightening in the air. She turned her gaze back to her husband, whose smile was now a tight, desperate rictus. "You forgot to tell your friends the most important news of all," she said, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of a thunderclap. She took a step back, breaking contact with him, and gently, deliberately placed both of her hands over her stomach, cradling the barely there swell of her ivory dress. "We're having a baby." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound that the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull of the yacht sounded like a roar. The champagne flutes froze halfway to lips. The smirks and whispers died. Then the explosion, not of congratulations, but of 1,000 silent calculations. Deals being reevaluated, alliances, shifting social stocks rising and falling. Isabella watched as the mask of pure shock on Adrian's face was quickly replaced by something else, a look of such cold, murderous fury that it made her heart stop. He had been outmaneuvered. In his world of power plays and strategic announcements, she had just launched a hostile takeover of his own narrative. On the moonlit deck of the Serafina, surrounded by his court of sycophants and sharks, Adrian Petrov, the master of the universe, was trapped, and his pregnant wife, the woman he had dismissed and deceived, held the entire world's attention with his hidden heir in her womb as her ultimate, undeniable trump card. The party was just getting started. The feigned applause that followed Isabella's announcement was a discordant mess. It was too loud, too forced, a clumsy attempt to paper over the gaping crater she had just blasted in the middle of the party. People rushed forward, their faces arranged in masks of delight. Adrian, my boy, a father. This calls for more champagne. The oligarch boomed, slapping Adrian's back with a force that made him stumble. Oh, Isabella, you're glowing. Absolutely radiant. A woman with a face stretched tight by surgery exclaimed, her eyes darting between Isabella's belly and Adrian's thunderous expression. Adrian, ever the performer, recovered with terrifying speed. He wrapped his arm around Isabella again, this time pulling her so close it was almost painful. He buried his face in her hair, a gesture that looked to the crowd like a moment of overwhelming emotion. But his whisper was venomous, a snake's hiss in her ear. You have no idea what you've just done. When we are done with this charade, you and I are going to have a talk you will never forget. He pulled back his face, a perfect portrait of a joyous father-to-be. We're just overwhelmed. We wanted to wait, to tell everyone, to have the moment for ourselves a little longer. But my wife, she's always been impatient. He laughed, and the crowd laughed with him, relieved to be given a script. He needed to get her away from the prying eyes. Darling, you must be exhausted. Come, let's get you some water. We have a quiet suite downstairs where you can put your feet up. It was an order, not an invitation. He steered her firmly towards a spiral staircase that led to the lower cabins, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of her arm, like talons. The eyes of the guests followed them, and Isabella felt a cold thrill of victory. She had ripped the curtain down. Now it was time to face the monster behind it. The moment the suite door clicked shut behind them, the transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The charming, smiling Adrian vanished as if he had never existed. The man who turned to face her was a stranger, his face pale with rage, his eyes glittering with a cold reptilian fury. "Are you insane?" he snarled, his voice, a low, guttural sound. He began to pace the opulent cabin, a caged tiger in a silk suit. The room was a smaller version of their sterile mansion, all cream leather, polished chrome, and impersonal art. Of all the stupid, reckless, emotionally incontinent things you could have possibly done, this is monumental. Isabella stood her ground, her back against the door. "I thought you'd be happy. You're going to be a father, Adrian." He stopped pacing and let out a short, barking laugh, devoid of all humor. "Happy? You think this is about being happy? This was never about happiness, you naive little fool. This is about power. This is about a multi-billion-dollar merger. This is about timing. He stalked towards her, his finger jabbing the air in front of her face. That deal I just closed, it was with Sheikh Al-Hamad, a man whose entire empire is built on family values, on legacy, on tradition. My position was precarious. He needed to know I was stable, that I was a man who understood the importance of an heir. So you were using me. Isabella stated the words, tasting like ash. You were using our baby. Using you. He laughed again, incredulous. Of course I was using you. Everything is about leverage. I was going to announce it myself next week at the Al-Hamad family dinner in Dubai. I had a speech prepared. It was going to be perfect. It would have sealed my position, made me untouchable. But you couldn't wait. You had to have your little moment of drama, didn't you? You had to stand in the middle of my party and make it all about you. His cruelty was so raw, so undisguised that it took her breath away. The man she thought she knew, the man she had loved, was a complete fabrication. Before her stood the real Adrian, a ruthless puppeteer, and she had just been one of his favorite marionettes. And what about her Isabella's voice was barely a whisper? Was Chloe Dubois part of the leverage too? Adrian's eyes narrowed. Chloe is business, a valuable asset, something you clearly know nothing about. She understands the game. She knows the rules. He looked her up and down, his gaze filled with contempt. You wanted to be a part of this world, Isabella. Well, this is it. It's not charity balls and pretty dresses. It's a battlefield. And you just walked into the middle of it with a target painted on your back. He turned away from her, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, the first sign of his composure cracking. You've ruined everything. Al-Hamad will see this for what it is, a desperate, pathetic sideshow. He'll think I can't even control my own wife. Isabella felt a flicker of defiance ignite within the cold terror. Maybe he'll think she's finally learned how to stand up for herself. Before Adrian could retort, a soft knock came at the door. Everything all right in there? A smooth baritone voice called out. Adrian's face shifted again, the mask of civility snapping back into place, albeit imperfectly this time. He opened the door to reveal a man Isabella recognized from the party's periphery. Julian Croft. He was Adrian's chief rival, the CEO of the company Adrian had just outmaneuvered. He was handsome in a more severe, classical way than Adrian, with intelligent, watchful eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Julian Adrian said, his voice tight. We're fine. Just a private moment. Julian Croft's gaze flickered past Adrian to Isabella. He offered her a small, sympathetic smile. Of course. My apologies. Well, the whole yacht is buzzing. Congratulations are in order, I suppose. His eyes held Isabella's for a moment longer than necessary, and in them she saw not just sympathy, but a keen, calculating intelligence. He was enjoying this. We appreciate it, Julian, Adrian said, attempting to close the door. But Julian placed a hand on it, stopping him. A man like you, Adrian, he said, his voice dropping slightly, a man who plans everything down to the last detail. I'm sure you have more than one celebration planned for this momentous news. He glanced pointedly back towards the deck, where Chloe Dubois was now surrounded by a group of men, laughing as if she didn't have a care in the world. Some celebrations are just more public than others. With a final knowing nod to Isabella, He turned and walked away. The seed of doubt he had planted was potent. More than one celebration. It echoed the cryptic note in the email about Ms. Dubois. This wasn't just about a business deal with a sheikh. There was another layer to Adrian's deception, something even more vital that her announcement had threatened. Adrian slammed the door, shut his face now, a mask of cold panic. Julian's words had clearly struck a nerve. He looked at Isabella, but he wasn't seeing her anymore. He was seeing a threat, a loose cannon that had just jeopardized a far more intricate game than she could possibly imagine. "Get dressed," he ordered, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We're leaving. The party's over." "My party is just beginning," Isabella retorted, a newfound strength hardening her voice. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to go back up there and enjoy the celebration. Our celebration." She reached for the doorknob, but he grabbed her wrist, his grip like steel. "You will do as you're told," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. You have no idea what's at stake." But for the first time, Isabella wasn't afraid. She was terrified, yes, but underneath the terror was a bedrock of certainty. She finally knew exactly who she was dealing with, and she knew that the life of the child inside her depended on her fighting back. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, and then back up at his face, her gaze unwavering. The cracks in his facade were showing, and she was determined to shatter it completely. Isabella wrenched her arm free from Adrian's grasp. The shock on his face at her defiance was almost comical. He was so accustomed to her compliance, her quiet acceptance, that this rebellion had short-circuited his brain. "Don't you ever touch me like that again," she said, her voice low and trembling, with a rage she hadn't known she possessed. "You want me to leave, fine. I'll leave. But I'll be taking a launch back to the villa, not scurrying away in disgrace with you." She turned her back on him and walked out of the suite, leaving him standing in the middle of the room, momentarily stunned into inaction. She didn't return to the main deck, where the party was attempting to regain its fractured momentum. The thought of the fake smiles and whispered gossip was suffocating. Instead, she sought refuge following a corridor towards the stern of the yacht, away from the music and the people. She found herself in a small, enclosed solarium. It was a quiet, forgotten space, filled with lush, potted palms and comfortable wicker chairs. Through the panoramic windows, she could see the yacht's wake, a trail of churning white foam under the relentless light of the moon. It felt like a visual representation of her life, a turbulent, messy path left in the wake of Adrian's relentless forward motion. She sank into a chair, the adrenaline from their confrontation draining away, leaving her shaky and exhausted. The weight of her new reality pressed down on her. Her husband didn't love her. He was using her, using their unborn child as a pawn in a game she didn't understand. And Julian Croft's words, more than one celebration. What did they mean? What was the real secret? Adrian was so terrified of her exposing. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening and closing somewhere nearby. It was Adrian's study, a room she had only been in once, a sanctuary of dark wood, leather, and technology from which he ruled his empire. She heard his voice, low and urgent. He was on the phone. Isabella, who had once prided herself on her integrity, on her refusal to eavesdrop or pry, found she no longer cared. She was a woman fighting for her child's future. The old rules no longer applied. She crept out of the solarium and pressed her ear against the heavy teak door of the study. His voice was a venomous whisper, tight with fury and panic. "I don't care what you have to do, just handle it." The timeline is accelerated. Everything has changed, he hissed. There was a pause. No, she doesn't know. She thinks this is about the Al-Hamad deal. Let her. It's better that way. She's a sentimental fool. She won't look any deeper. Isabella's stomach clenched. A sentimental fool. That's all she was to him. Adrian continued, his voice dropping even lower, forcing Isabella to press her ear harder against the cold wood. Listen to me very carefully. The Costa Rican asset needs to be liquidated. All of it. I want the funds transferred to the Cayman account by Monday morning, no later. And I mean all of it. The property, the holdings, everything. We need to be clean. Costa Rica. The Cayman Islands. The words were business jargon, but the context felt deeply, dangerously personal. It sounded like a man erasing a life. There was another, longer pause. Isabella could hear the faint, tinny squawk of the person on the other end of the line. Then Adrian's voice returned, and the words he spoke sent a shard of ice through her heart. And make sure she never finds out. He said, the words clipped and brutal. If she gets wind of this before I'm ready, she could ruin everything. I'll handle the situation here. Just make sure the package is ready for delivery. I'll be in touch with the details. The line went dead. Isabella stumbled back from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Who was she? Was it her? Was he talking about her? Was the package her baby? The thought was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that she felt bile rise in her throat. He was going to handle her. He was liquidating assets, moving money to an offshore account known for its impenetrable secrecy. This was not the behavior of a man trying to salvage a business deal. This was the behavior of a man preparing to disappear, to erase a part of his life completely. Her mind raced. She needed proof. She needed something tangible, something that would translate her formless terror into undeniable fact. His study. He was so panicked, so distracted that he might have gotten careless. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, until she heard the study door open and his footsteps recede down the corridor in the opposite direction. He was likely going back to the party to resume his role as the beaming father-to-be to control the damage. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Isabella tried the handle of the study door. It was unlocked. She slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The room smelled of leather and Adrian's expensive cologne. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, a sleek, state-of-the-art laptop sitting open on its surface. She ignored it, knowing it would be protected by passwords she could never guess. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. Then she saw it. A dark leather briefcase pushed hastily under the desk, not quite out of sight. It was not his usual one. This was older, more worn. It looked like something he kept for private, sensitive matters. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out and laid it on the desk. The latches were not locked. With a deep breath, she flicked them open. The contents were not what she expected. There were no fools on the Al-Hamad deal, no corporate acquisition paperwork. There was a single thick manila folder. Her name was written on the tab in Adrian's sharp, decisive handwriting, Isabella Petrov. Her blood ran cold. With a sense of dread so profound, it felt like she was moving underwater. She opened the folder. The first document was a prenuptial agreement. Not the one she had signed, a fairly standard document her own lawyers had reviewed. This was a different version, a revised draft, dated 6 months ago. It was ruthless. In the event of a divorce, she would be left with virtually nothing, stripped of any claim to his assets, his companies, his homes. A clause was circled in red ink, a clause about moral turpitude and public disgrace, stating that any action which brought the family name into disrepute would nullify the agreement entirely, leaving her utterly destitute. Her stunt tonight would have certainly qualified. Beneath that was something even more sinister. It was a life insurance policy. A policy taken out on her. The beneficiary was not their estate. It was a holding company she had never heard of, registered in the Cayman Islands. The payout was astronomical, a figure so large it seemed like a typo. $50 million. The date the policy was enacted was stamped clearly at the bottom. It was 5 weeks ago, just days after she had joyfully, tearfully told Adrian that she was pregnant. Isabella sank into the leather chair behind the desk, the document spread out before her like a death sentence. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. The distance, the secret party, the rage at her announcement, the liquidation of assets, the life insurance policy. He wasn't planning to divorce her. He was planning to erase her. She thought of the package he had mentioned on the phone. Was it possible? Could he be so monstrous as to arrange for an accident? One that would leave him a grieving widower, a single father to a newborn heir, and $50 million richer. It was the plot of a low-budget thriller, too outlandish to be real. But looking at the cold, hard proof in front of her, Isabella knew. It was real, and it was happening to her. The poisoned whisper she had overheard through the door had not been a misunderstanding. It had been her husband, her child's father, calmly and methodically planning her demise. She was no longer just a sentimental fool in his eyes. She was a liability to be neutralized. And the hidden heir in her womb was not a joy to be celebrated, but a complication to be managed in the aftermath of her death. The muted thrum of the party outside the study's soundproofed walls was a grotesque symphony of ignorance. They were out there, these titans of industry, and their glittering consorts drinking champagne and celebrating a monster completely oblivious to the fact that the man they toasted was not just a corporate predator, but a man who had coldly calculated the monetary value of his own wife's life. A cold, clear fury, purer and more potent than any emotion she had ever experienced, washed through Isabella. It was a cleansing fire, incinerating the last remnants of fear, of love, of hope for what might have been. It was the primal incandescent rage of a mother protecting her young from a viper. She did not weep. The time for tears was over, a luxury afforded to victims, and she would not be a victim. She meticulously gathered the documents, the vicious secret prenup, the damning life insurance policy with its Cayman Islands beneficiary. They felt heavy in her hand, not with the weight of paper, but with the weight of absolute proof. This was her weapon now, her shield. She would not be handled. She would not be erased. She would be the storm that broke his carefully constructed world. She walked out of the study, her steps steady, her posture erect. She moved with a purpose that felt entirely new, as if the shock had fused her spine with steel. As she moved through the yacht's luxurious corridors, she caught her reflection in a pane of polished glass. The pale, uncertain woman from the villa was gone. In her place was a figure robed in ivory, her face a mask of chilling resolve, her eyes burning with a righteous fire. Emerging onto the main deck was like stepping onto a stage. The party, having recovered from her initial arrival, had regained its fractured momentum. The jazz band played a smooth, innocuous tune. Waiters circulated with trays of glistening canapes, and at the very center of it all, holding court, was Adrian. He stood with a small group of his most important guests, the the Russian oligarch Dmitry Volkov, two stern-faced German investors, and to her grim satisfaction, Julian Croft, who was observing the scene with the unnerving stillness of a patient predator. Adrian had a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, and he was laughing a rich, confident sound that boomed across the deck. He looked completely at ease, a king in his castle, having dismissed her earlier outburst as a minor feminine hysteria he had already capably managed. He saw her approaching, and the indulgent smile on his face tightened into a flicker of profound annoyance. He clearly expected her to be sequestered below, weeping or sleeping. Her presence here now was an act of insubordination. "Darling," he said, stepping forward to intercept her before she could reach the group, his voice a low warning disguised as endearment. "I thought we agreed you needed to rest. You look pale." "I've never felt clearer in my life," Isabella said, her voice dangerously calm, loud enough to cut through the nearby chatter. She elegantly sidestepped his attempt to block her moving directly into the center of the influential circle. The conversation faltered. All eyes turned to her. She had their undivided attention. "Adrian," she began, addressing him, but projecting her voice to everyone present. "I apologize for interrupting your very important conversations, but I was just doing some light reading in your study. You really should be more careful about where you leave your private papers. It's so revealing." Adrian's smile was gone, replaced by a rigid mask of fury. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly pale sheen under the party lights. "Isabella," he gritted out, "this is neither the time nor the place for your games." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time and place," she retorted, her voice as sharp and cold as breaking ice. She held up the sheaf of papers, her hand perfectly steady. "I think your friends, your partners, the men whose fortunes are tied to yours, should know what a thoughtful, forward-thinking husband you are. A real family man." She held up the life insurance policy, letting the moonlight catch the official letterhead. "For example, this fascinating document, a life insurance policy for $50 million, taken out on me just last month. Isn't that romantic?" Her voice dripped with a venomous sarcasm that made the German investors exchange a nervous glance. "He's ensuring my future, our child's future, is utterly secure." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "The only strange thing is the beneficiary isn't our family. It's a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. I believe the file was labeled contingency." "And what a coincidence," she added, her eyes locking onto Adrian's. "It's the same tax haven you were just screaming at your associate to liquidate all your Costa Rican assets to. I imagine that's just prudent financial planning, too." A collective audible gasp went through the small crowd. Dmitry Volkov, the oligarch, stared openly, his jovial expression gone, replaced by the hard, calculating look of a man sniffing out a massive liability. Julian Croft's eyebrow arched in a perfect expression of feigned surprise, but his eyes danced with undisguised glee. Adrian's composure, his entire life's performance of unassailable control, finally irrevocably shattered. He was no longer a charming host or a brilliant CEO. He was a cornered animal. He lunged forward, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage, and grabbed for her arm, trying to snatch the papers away. "Give me those. You're hysterical. You have no idea what you're talking about." Isabella pulled back with surprising strength, clutching the documents to her chest. "Hysterical, am I?" Her voice rose, ringing with righteous fury, a clarion call of accusation that silenced the entire yacht. The band trailed off mid-note. Every head on every deck turned towards them. Or did I just discover that my husband, the celebrated father-to-be, is planning to have me killed for an insurance payout? The accusation hung in the hot, humid air, monstrous, unthinkable, and utterly riveting. A woman screamed somewhere on the upper deck. The idyllic party had just turned into a public trial. And then Adrian began to laugh. It was not a sound of humor or mirth. It was a ghastly, unhinged torrent of sound that clawed its way out of his throat. He threw his head back and howled at the moon, a laugh of pure nihilistic amusement. It was the laugh of a man who had been caught but felt no remorse, only contempt for the fool who had caught him. The chilling sound washed over the guests, more terrifying than any threat. "Killed," he wheezed, wiping a genuine tear of laughter from his eye. He looked at Isabella as if she were the most pathetic, idiotic creature he had ever seen. "Oh, my sweet, darling, naive little wife. Your imagination is spectacular. You read too many cheap novels." He turned to the stunned, silent crowd. "My friends, I do apologize. My wife is unwell. These pregnancy hormones can be so dreadfully dramatic." He turned back to Isabella, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying, triumphant light that bespoke a much deeper level of depravity. "The insurance policy. The prenup. My dear, that's just business. A contingency plan. Paperwork to keep the lawyers busy in a worst-case scenario. You found a smokescreen, Isabella, not a murder plot. You are so much less important than that." He took a step closer, invading her space, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial purr that was meant to unnerve and dominate. "The real secret," he said, savoring the moment, the absolute power of his hidden truth. "The real reason for this party is so much more magnificent than your pedestrian little fantasies." His eyes scanned the crowd, a showman preparing for his grand reveal. "You all think this party is for the Al-Hamad deal a trifle. You think I'm celebrating a corporate victory insignificant." He paused, letting the tension coil into an unbearable knot. "Tonight, Isabella, is my 5-year wedding anniversary." Isabella could only stare, her mind struggling to process the non sequitur. Our anniversary isn't for another 3 months." Adrian's smile was a slash of pure predatory victory. "Not our anniversary, my love. My anniversary with my other wife." The world did not just tilt, it disintegrated. The sounds of the yacht, the sea, the shocked gasps of the onlookers all faded into a dull, static roar in Isabella's ears. Other. Wife. The words were alien, nonsensical, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow. "Her name is Sophia." Adrian continued gloating, now feeding off the collective shock. "She's at our home in the Cayman Islands. Our real home. She's a magnificent woman from a powerful family in Colombia, not a naive journalist. She understands how the world really works, and she is waiting for me along with our 4-year-old son Alexander, my real heir. He has my eyes. He had a family, a whole other life. A son. The secrecy, the endless business trips, the coldness, the lies, it all cascaded down on Isabella in a torrent of unbearable, clarifying truth. She wasn't the wife he was planning to kill. She was worse. She was irrelevant. A prop. The beautiful, socially acceptable American wife he used to open doors in the West, while his real life, his real family was hidden away in a fortress of offshore accounts and secrecy. The Costa Rican assets. It was Sophia's family money, being shielded before the inevitable fallout of his eventual quiet divorce from his American problem. You are a bigamist," Dmitri Volkov sputtered, staring at Adrian as if he were a creature from the abyss. "Details, details." Adrian waved a dismissive hand, drunk on his own audacity. "You see, Isabella, Your pregnancy was a terribly inconvenient complication. My plan was to eventually tire of you divorce, you quietly give you a comfortable but not extravagant settlement, and consolidate my life with my real family. But then you announced this. He gestured towards her stomach with disgust. So the plan had to change. I wasn't going to kill you too messy, too many questions. I was simply going to paint you as an unstable, hysterical, unfit mother, and I would have taken our child. My second son. It would have been a nasty custody battle, but I would have won. I always win. The sheer breathtaking scope of his evil, the meticulous, cold-hearted architecture of his deception, was beyond anything Isabella could have imagined. She felt the strength drain from her limbs and stumbled backward, the damning papers fluttering from her grasp. But before she could fall, a strong, steady arm caught her. It was Julian Croft. He moved with fluid grace, stepping in front of Isabella, effectively shielding her. His expression was no longer one of amusement. It was the cold, hard face of a victor. "It's over, Adrian," Julian said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "Your little game is up." Adrian stared at him, his victorious smirk finally faltering a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What are you talking about, Croft? Don't tell me you've developed a conscience." "Conscience has nothing to do with it. This is just good business," Julian said calmly. "I've known about Sophia for 6 months. A disgruntled vice president of yours is remarkably talkative when you offer him a senior position at a rival company. I've been feeding her information ever since. About your indiscretions, about your public wife. I even gave her a little anonymous tip that you might be having a very special, very secret celebration on your yacht tonight." He looked at Isabella, and for the first time his eyes held a flicker of something that might have been genuine respect. "I knew he'd underestimate you. I knew that if you were pushed far enough, you'd do something spectacular. And you did not disappoint." Julian pulled out his phone, its screen glowing in the dim light. "Sophia is a very clever woman, Adrian. And a very, very angry one. She's on a conference call right now with 3 members of your board of directors, the head of enforcement at the SEC, and a senior journalist from the Wall Street Journal. She has authenticated marriage certificates, her son's birth certificate, bank statements, detailing your illegal asset transfers. Everything. Your kingdom isn't just being threatened, Adrian. It's already gone." The color drained completely from Adrian's face. The mask of the master of the universe dissolved, revealing a hollowed-out, panicked man. He looked around wildly at the faces of his former allies, who were now backing away from him as if he were carrying a plague. He looked at the German investors who were already speaking frantically into their phones. He looked at Julian, the architect of his ruin. And finally he looked at Isabella, at the woman he had so casually planned to destroy, and saw not a victim, but a terrifying angel of judgment. The maelstrom had hit. The moonlit yacht party had become the scene of a spectacular, inescapable shipwreck, and Adrian Petrov, the man with 2 wives, 2 lives, and no heart, was going down with the vessel. The fallout was catastrophic. In the aftermath of that moonlit night, Adrian Petrov's empire didn't just crumble. It was pulverized. The story of his bigamy, his cruelty, and his breathtaking deceit became a global scandal, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and splattered across tabloids. He lost his company, his fortune, and his freedom buried under an avalanche of legal battles from 2 wives, cheated investors, and federal investigators. The Serafina was seized, a silent, floating tombstone for a dead legacy. But for Isabella, the storm's end was the beginning of a new, quiet dawn. She did not want revenge or a piece of his ruined empire. She wanted peace. She retreated from the world that had almost consumed her, finding solace not in a marble mansion, but in a small sunlit house by the sea, far from the whispers and the wreckage. There she rediscovered the woman she was, before Adrian's strong, independent, and fiercely protective of the new life growing within her. Her journey was a brutal one, a trial by fire that burned away a life of illusion to reveal a core of unbreakable strength. She learned that true wealth isn't measured in yachts and stock prices, but in the fierce, unwavering love a mother has for her child, the one true heir to a future she would build with her own 2 hands. What would you have done in Isabella's shoes? How does a woman find the courage to fight back against a monster who wears the face of the man she loves? If this story of betrayal, survival, and a mother's incredible strength captivated you, please let us know by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story where the queen topples the king. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next tale of drama and twisted fortunes. What do you think Isabella should name her baby? Let us know in the comments below.